Welcome to another episode of Off the Menu. I'm Vincent Franchini here with Charles Coulombe.
Hello.
Today we've got questions on Ultra-Realism, The Lord of the Rings, and Joseph de Maistre. But first, let's talk about the election.
Oh boy, let's.
We've made it through two debates relatively unscathed.
Well, three if you count the vice presidents, but yeah.
Oh, that's true. What's your take on the state of the election right now?
Well, let me see. Ominous laughter is probably not the best response or the most useful one. You'll be sorry. Again, not helpful. Well, I would say that in the first debate, Trump came across very badly, I thought. And Mrs. Clinton did a creditable job, but it wasn't that hard. In the second debate, Trump did a lot better. Much better. He was much more together. He brought up some heavy guns, which frankly I didn't understand why he didn't bring them up in the first one. You know, Benghazi, everything that the missing emails, all that stuff, which he didn't bring up the first time, which I thought he should have. I thought I'll appoint a special prosecutor. You're going to go to jail. I mean, so of two minds. On the one hand, it was very funny. I mean, it was great street theater. But on the other, that's the first presidential debate where one candidate has threatened the other. So, I can't complain too much because, after all, as a society, we're losing every claim to civility. And if presidential candidates can't have the same freedom the rest of us do, what good is mother and apple pie? So that's that. She got in a couple of good singers, but the problem she faces, and I've said this in the beginning, she attempted, or her handlers, or whomever, to give us the October surprise with this locker room chat. Now, of course, there's no way that they just discovered that. That thing's been around since 2005. And I have no doubt it was supposed to be the October surprise. But I think it's going to be a squib that fizzles out for two reasons. One, because, of course, Mrs. Clinton has a lot more baggage in that area, which he pointed out. When it came to actually doing things, he said, I'm all action, she's all talk. When it came to this area, he said, well, in this area, she's all action and I'm all talk. Because, of course, he made a great deal of reference to Bill Clinton's escapades and to her going alongside.
Yeah.
As also to her defending the rapist of a 12-year-old. And he, of course, had all the various offended ladies in the front row, which, again, it's great street theater.
Yeah.
See, the fact that all of this stuff is in the fore shows you where we've gone as a people, which brings you to the second part. We're a very foul-mouthed society. You look at these music videos where you've got all these very well-known singers twerking their hearts out, if it's their hearts they're twerking. I don't know what you twerk, but I presume it's the heart. At any rate, such a society is not really in a position to say, oh, that's just awful, I could spit. I mean, he's a foul-mouthed bore, absolutely. Not unlike a huge chunk of people today. That's the problem we've got. We've managed to turn our country into this sort of huge bordello. And so for someone to complain, it's terrible, but the man down in room 38, he's got a foul mouth on him. Yeah, it's a bordello. You're lucky all he's got is a foul mouth. I'm not saying also, and let me be the first to assure all and sundry, I hardly think that a Trump presidency is going to pull us out of the bordello, because it's who we've become. And fixing that is not going to happen at the voting booth.
Okay, so you don't think that his foul mouth impacted anything, really, because we're used to it?
We're used to it. I mean, I'm so old, I can remember how shocked we all were to find out Richard Nixon had a potty mouth. This went a long way, alongside the free speech movement, this went a long way toward legitimizing the use of foul language in public. When Nixon, it turned out that Nixon spoke that way. This was big news. And of course, monkey see, monkey do. We like to imitate our betters. You get the idea. I really don't think that that's going to make much of an impact. And again, as he said last night, she said, "Well, this shows Donald's attitude toward women." Yeah, like her husband. The problem is she can't really play that card. Somebody else could. Joan of Arc could do it. She can't do it. She's not Joan of Arc. She may think she's Joan of Arc. She's not. I wish she'd wear a skirt or a dress, be a little more human. I hate these pantsuits of hers, especially because they're polyester. You know how many polyesters die to make one of those suits? Well, it's terrible. That's why you won't see polyesters in the wild anymore.
Okay.
You don't believe me, I can tell. You won't. Go and look. You won't see them.
All right, next question. Laramie Hirsch writes, "It seems to me that as oligarchs rule, things become more chaotic, and as the population grows, power seems to solidify into an untouchable central authority. Charles touched on this in his book Star-Spangled Crown when he discussed the boroughs and the burghs of the British Isles. A more modern example of runaway oligarchy, I think, is America's current untouchable political class. But for your on-the-street layman, what is the difference between an oligarchy and a monarchy?"
Well, the difference is actually pretty big. A monarchy is, of course, a form of government where you have a single monarch, usually, but not always hereditary, which is at once legitimized and limited by tradition and religion and various other factors. An oligarchy is a ruling class, which may or may not be responsible to someone or other. You can have a monarchy and an oligarchy at the same time. You can have a republic and an oligarchy at the same time. You can have any form of government you like with an oligarchy. But the question is, how responsive is that oligarchy to the actual needs of its subjects? What kind of check is there on its power? In some societies, you can have like Venice, for instance, which was a republic of sorts, although they had a duke, the Doge. There was an oligarchy they were the ones who voted, nobody else did. But both their religion, the almost crushing weight of custom in Venice, and a number of other factors, kept them fairly efficient as rulers for a long time. What you really have a problem with, and this I think has happened in our own country today, is when you get an oligarchy that is untrammeled by any kind of tradition, has no effective check on its power, and no real belief in anything save itself. When you have an oligarchy that no longer cares about the welfare of its subjects, then you acquire a parasite that will kill the host, unless they're overthrown or get a new oligarchy.
Okay, well, what would be an example of a good check on an oligarchy so that they're not a parasite?
Well, as I say, I brought up Venice, but usually when you've got an hereditary king, you've got a good check
Oh, yeah.
on the oligarchy, partly because he's hereditary, partly because he may rule through them, but he also has an appeal to the people below them. You see, the king has to try to be father to all his subjects, not just those on top.
What about in our system?
Well, in our system, there's no check on the oligarchy at all.
Yeah.
And the oligarchy, moreover, have no belief that would restrain them. They have a belief structure of sorts, but it's completely self-aggrandizing. The problem with it, though, is it doesn't really confer legitimacy on them. What Mrs. Clinton was going on about last night was really the credo of the oligarchy. The so-called woman's right to choose, infanticide. So-called marriage equality, sodomy. These are what our ruling class are into. And it's not just sexual stuff. I mean, that's small potatoes, really. But it's all economic, all this worldly. Donald, who certainly has been a member of that oligarchy, at least in financial terms, for a long time, He identified a couple of other members of it. George Soros, Warren Buffett.
Mm-hmm.
And really, George Soros, alongside Rupert Murdoch, is like a poster child for the modern oligarchy. Because he's not this and he's not that. It's not an oligarchy that's based on any ethnic unity. It's not based on anything other than money and power. That's why it's so hard to identify. But you look at a man like, Rupert Murdoch. Now, Rupert Murdoch is a world player like Soros. He knows no boundaries. He gave up his Australian citizenship. In Australia, he's the bankroller of the Australian Republican movement. In the United States, he's the owner of Fox News and the so-called Republican.
Mm-hmm.
But then in Britain, he was Tony Blair's paymaster and the Mother Bountiful of the Labour Party. Now, these are very different roles.
Yeah.
And you would say, gee, what's his ideology? Well, his ideology is Rupert Murdoch. The problem, though, is that you cannot sustain over a long period of time an oligarchy that's like that. If all they see is themselves and their own power, their own whatever it is going on, those little pointed heads of theirs, they must either be replaced or the fabric of society crumble. One or the other. I mean, to bring it down to its most basic, a society that cannot sustain itself via population will die. You have to have bodies to bleed for you and to be milked for your treasure. If you don't have them, you don't have them. The problem, of course, is that the way these folk see to remedy that is to abolish nations and bring in all sorts of immigrants to take up the slack. Well, you can do that, but then you change the nature of the country. And the problem is, too, the people you bring in will not have the habits of obedience to the oligarchy that your native-born did. So you play with fire. You know, the old joke about the woodman who was sitting on a branch in a tree and was busy sawing it.
Yeah.
And then didn't understand why he fell down and broke his neck. You know, it was a little too tough for him to catch on to. Our oligarchs are the same way. They don't realize that they're doing themselves. And they don't care. So, what's not to like?
Okay. Gabriel has 3 questions for you on Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
First question. Tolkien himself has stated that Lord of the Rings was a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, and that because of that, he went through his work and consciously cut out virtually all references to cults or religious practices. I've never understood why he did this. There are even a few scholars out there who try and claim the work is more pagan than Christian. Rather than making the religious element explicit, Tolkien made it implicit, absorbed into the story and symbolism. Was this a good thing?
I think it was, because it expanded the appeal of the work to a larger number of people. There are a ton of people, if they had known it was a Catholic work, wouldn't have touched it. But it's had an influence on them. And let me say this about The Lord of the Rings. I've said it before, I'll say it again. It has a lot of motifs from Catholic history woven into the story, which I've written about elsewhere at different times. But what gives the story its power is that it's a meditation on the interaction between grace and free will. And it illustrates in the story how they work in real life. The old saying, God rides straight with crooked lines. There are 2 or 3 areas in the story, really, where this becomes almost explicit. The first is when Frodo and Gandalf, I believe, are talking about the ring. And Gandalf says, well, you know, this should be a comfort to you that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker. Well, it's the closest he comes in the body of the work to talking about the divine will. Except that, notice that by people trying to follow a moral law, good things happen. Even despite themselves. So even Gollum has a role to play. Had Gollum not been spared, Frodo would have succumbed to the ring, and the whole quest would have been a failure.
Mm-hmm.
But because evil Gollum was allowed to live, he played his part at the end. And Frodo was saved from himself by Gollum. Frodo's afterlife, if you will, was saved by Gollum the way Gollum's life was saved by Frodo.
Wow.
And the third point where it becomes apparent is when Gandalf, and this is in one of the appendices, Gandalf is talking about the prequel to The Hobbit and how he had been sitting in the inn at Bree one night and ran into Thorin Oakenshield. So he goes on this long chat about what would have happened had Smaug not been killed. And he ends it by saying, Dragonfire and Lorien, and perhaps no queen in Gondor. And none of that came to pass because I happened to run into Thorin Oakenshield one day in the inn at Bree. A chance meeting, as we say in Middle-earth. Well, unfortunately, that beautiful phrase was destroyed in the movie version of The Hobbit. I mean, absolutely wrecked.
Mm-hmm.
Because there it's just made to seem like Gandalf had planned the whole thing. The point was Gandalf didn't plan it. And he didn't know where it would lead. It just seemed to be something that they should do.
Yeah.
And then he thought, okay, well, they're not going to succeed without a bit of my help and a hobbit. So I needed to get me a hobbit to play burglar for them. And that's what he did. And it was why they went into the Shire, why they got Bilbo, why the whole thing began. A chance meeting, as we say in Middle-earth. And then, if you look back at everything decent that's ever happened to you in your own life, every friend you've made that was close to you, every wonderful thing that's ever happened to you, it is the result of a concatenation of circumstances so involved that no novelist could have come up with it.
That's true.
Yeah, because see, that's how life really is. And Tolkien depicted it perfectly in The Lord of the Rings. That is the real power of the book.
Wow. Okay, next question. What do you think of the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy?
Sorry. Actually, I enjoyed it, but I did so by divorcing it from the book.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of friends of mine who are very much into Lord of the Rings hated the thing. And very often it's what the complaint boils down to is it's not the movie in my head. No, it's not, and it won't ever be. So you have to separate the two.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at it as a work on its own right, it's a pretty good piece of filmmaking. Is it a faithful recreation of Lord of the Rings? Partly. I do say that if it's in your power, never let anyone see the movie before they read the book. Read the book first, then see the movie. Don't do it the other way around. Because you want the book to work on your imagination. You don't want Peter Jackson to work on your head first.
Okay. And let's just pretend that the Hobbit trilogy just never happened.
Please.
Can we do that? Yeah.
Please.
Okay, good.
That was... I know we're pretending it didn't happen,
Yeah.
But it was so bad. You know...
Yeah, next question. I'm sorry.
All right.
There seems little relation between Tolkien's godly elves and the elves of folklore, who are a wild, unpredictable bunch, with some being good, albeit mischievous, while others are just plain evil. Do you feel this is a positive change?
Well, yeah. I mean, Tolkien's elves are sort of funhouse mirror reflections, in a good way, of the so-called Seelie court of Scottish folklore, which has its equivalents in other folklore. That is to say, the good elves, who I was going to say in real life, but in real folklore anyway, are mischievous and unpredictable. The elves, Tolkien's elves, are noble, but fallen. But I think it's a very useful thing, a good thing they did that, because they show us the limits, again, of free will. You know, when you first read The Lord of the Rings, The elves come across as purely noble, purely wonderful, with faint glimmerings like in Galadriel's song. But if I should mount a ship, what ship would take me back across so wide a sea? Faint intimations that, there's something with these guys. They've got a problem. And then the Silmarillion makes it explicit. The High Elves of Middle-earth are there because they revolted against the Valar. And they came to a Middle-earth that was involved in a struggle with Morgoth, who was Sauron's mentor, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
They came to the aid of men who were struggling against them, but they were there in the first place because of their own rebelliousness. And the Valar were not obligated to do anything for them. It was only at the very end, with the tremendous appeal, not just of the elves, but of the men, that the Valar intervened to save them and overthrew Morgoth. In this, we see the limitations even of nobility. We see how self-centeredness and pride can destroy the noble. The story of the elves is really a tragedy, of the elves of Middle-earth. It's a tragedy. They have come over from beyond the sea,
Mm-hmm.
rebelling against their rightful lords to take back the Silmarillia, the three Silmarils, to take them back from Morgoth. Why? Pride. What did it matter, really, if Morgoth had kept them, as far as they were concerned? Not a lot. I mean, it was annoying what he did, but they wouldn't really have lost out. And the proof of the pudding is the two of the elven tribes stayed in Valinor. And they were fine, They were hanging out, having a good day. So it is the tragedy of the elves is the tragedy of a noble people brought to naught by pride and self-will. And that's an important lesson. It's not one you would have gotten from the elves in folklore.
No, certainly not. Okay, Austin sent in a question. Does Mr. Coulombe think that ultra-realism can become resurgent in numbers of adherents among the Church's theologians? And if it can, how would it affect the faithful, the Church, and the world?
Well, these things are cyclical. The ultra-realists had a spate of popularity toward the beginning of the 19th century. And they have, every now and then, revivals of interest. Tolkien, whom we were speaking of, was pretty much an ultra-realist. Why? Because he was a Neoplatonist, which the Church Fathers were. A lot of the scholastics were. And from time to time in the history of the Church, we sort of rediscover the Church Fathers. We rediscover the medieval scholastics other than St. Thomas. And I think it's also important to bear in mind that these different schools, to include the Thomists, traditionally acted as correctives on one another's excesses. Because they all have them. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as what the result will be when this happens again, for the period that it's the case, I think it will have the effect of, to the degree that it has an effect, of making the church, the faith, more real to its practitioners, of being an all-encompassing kind of life, rather than merely a set of intellectual propositions to be adhered to or refused. You see, part of the problem with Catholics today is that we do not have a Catholic imagination. So we don't see things through the prism of our faith, which we should do. We don't look at the chalice, at the elevation, and see the Holy Grail. But that's what it is. We don't look at the Sacred Heart or the Precious Blood as having any kind of significance other than the purely devotional, except that they go directly into the kingship of Christ, which kingship we're all a part of. The whole notion of the mystical body of Christ, something that is greater than the sum of its parts, is a concept that, while we still repeat it today, is kind of lost on us. I suspect that whenever ultra-realism comes back in vogue, these things will once more have a grasp on the hearts and minds of Catholics.
Are there any theologians today that are outwardly ultra-realist? Is Pope Benedict an ultra-realist?
Well, he certainly tends that way. I mean, whether or not they call themselves that, the trick is always, do they rely on the church fathers? Do they rely on the doctors other than and alongside St. Thomas? And again, I'm not talking about getting rid of St. Thomas. That's important to understand. St. Thomas himself, for a big chunk of his life, was an ultra-realist. And that really comes out in things like the Catena Aurea and so on. Probably my favorite, I don't know if he'd accept the title, but I'd give it to him. My favorite theologian in English right now, Father Aidan Nichols, O.P., whose work really, really deserves a lot wider reception than it has. Books like Christendom Awake and The Realm. And that, I mean, Christendom Awake, which really talks about a sort of Catholic revival in every aspect of life, that's precisely what I'm talking about. Whether or not someone calls himself an ultra-realist, it'll be made manifest by the width of his thought and his interests. It's the nature of the philosophy.
Okay. Anthony asks, what is your opinion on Joseph de Maistre? Do you think he was a good philosopher? And what is your opinion on the Counterrevolution as a whole?
Well, that's a good question. But I love de Maistre. He's one of the great influences on my own thinking, to the degree that I think. Now, when you say the Counterrevolution, I'm presuming he means the writers of the early 19th century, like de Maistre, de Bonald, Chateaubriand, in France, the Schlegels and Haller, and people like that in German-speaking countries. Donoso Cortez and Balmes in Spain, and not Monaldo, the other one, Leopardi anyway, in Italy. A whole bunch of these fellows writing at the same time. And they were all writing against the French Revolution. And the answer is I'm all for them. And the great news is that today, and not just for them, but also each of them in their particular countries, France, Spain, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, and so on, had left a sort of family tree of disciples down to the present. Now, up until recently, these people were mostly inaccessible to us in the English-speaking world. But today, we live in the information age, and through the miracle of Google Translate, even if you don't speak the language, say, if you don't speak French, although a lot of domestic work is available in English, a lot of it's not. And you can Google Translate the thing out of either Gutenberg, the Internet Archive, or Google Books. Well, you can read this stuff yourself. If you do it in Google Translate, of course, with a weird sort of pidgin English.
Yeah.
And you'll miss a good chunk. But you'll read enough to get your brain going. So these things are all available to us now. And I think it's very important that we explore them. Dust them off, have another look at them. Same with the ultra-realists. Have another look. Because they all have things to say which have a bearing on where we are now. In a very real sense, the revolution of 1789, to a degree 1776, that revolution's basic dictum was, you yourself shall be as gods, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. That is the dictum that animates our oligarchies today. They are the result, the product of that mindset. If we are to survive them, we have to begin to revive good, strong thought. There's even in Italian a dictionary of these sorts of people, of the counter-revolutionaries, and it's called Toward a Dictionary of Strong Thought. So it shows you that thought can be strong, despite what you were taught in school.
Okay. What about, so are we talking more about restoration of monarchy, counter-revolution? What about, like, the founder of TFP, who wrote Revolution and Counter-Revolution?
Well, that's the interesting thing. It's a very good book, Revolution and Counterrevolution. It does, however, leave out kind of a chunk of the question. And that chunk is, for want of a better word, the social justice piece. The guilds, the widespread ownership of agriculture, which is why one of the charges, and again, I'm not going to tell you if I think this is just or not, because I don't know, but one of the charges against some of the TFP from Catholics
Right.
is that they tend to ally with neocons and people like that, simply because it's a question of purely safeguarding the rights of the wealthy. Now, don't be mistaken. The rights of the wealthy are very important. They are. Why is this? Because in any given society, and this includes our own oligarchs, who provide the jobs, who stimulate the economy. I mean, the problem when you say, well, let's soak the rich and distribute the money amongst the poor. Well, the problem is, if you do that, the rich, if they've got enough money, will just pick up and leave. And even if they can't, and you take everything they've got, it's all going to be gone. Firstly, the government that sucks it up from them will eat most of it. And then what little goes to the people will be gone in a heartbeat. All you'll end up with are a lot of empty, big houses. So that part is certainly very correct. But it also has to be remembered that in a truly Catholic society, they are part of a whole. They're not the reason for being of the society. The peasantry I can say these words, play their part. I've had a lot of trouble with that word recently. I went by McDonald's and I couldn't pronounce play place. I could say pay place, or I could say play pace, but I couldn't say play place. It was hard. Anyway, so yeah, I know it's.
Why would you say that at McDonald's?
Well, because I was reading the big sign that said play place.
Oh, okay.
And I found myself, and I was sober. It was terrible. Anyway, but that part, the social justice element, the distributist element, if you like, the social credit element, call it whatever you like, the guild socialism, I don't know. Call it whatever you like, that part tends to get left out of TFP analysis. But that is not to discount the value of the work they've done, either. I mean, one of the problems you run into is that, especially those of us who are of, I hate to use the phrase, marginal political views, is the temptation to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's a big temptation. And what you end up with as a result are a lot of fragmented little schools instead of anything approaching a movement. So, don't let my critique of the TFP be seen as a condemnation, because they're doing things other people aren't doing. I mean, if you look around right now at the scheme of things, you've got pro-lifers, you've got this, you've got that. Well, yeah, but the pro-lifers aren't doing anything about the lack of decent classical education. Yeah, I know. They're doing what they do.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but the classical education people aren't doing anything about saving babies' lives. Yeah, I know. They're doing what they do. The historical preservation people, they're not, yes, I understand. The thing is, what faces us is so huge. One opposes it in all sorts of different areas. And every individual has only so much energy. You can't expect a pro-lifer who's giving all his time to saving infants to be agitating for the restoration of Latin to the schools. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And contrary-wise. That's why it's important to see how they're both working in the same direction. Both very valuable. I mean, I grant you that abortion is really a litmus test.
Of course.
You know, well, my candidate's good on everything except his desire to slaughter senior citizens. Who in their right mind would say that?
You're right.
But having given it that sort of primacy, it has to be borne in mind also that that's only one of the many ills our oligarchs have inflicted upon us. So, what I would say is, this is just parenthetical to everything else, but if you find yourself employed in one area or other of the struggle, that's great. Throw yourself into it. But for heaven's sake, don't criticize those who are doing another kind of good elsewhere. They're doing their part where and when and as and how they can. Do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Otherwise, I should have to disapprove of everyone who can't speak Canadian French. And we know how bad that would be. I mean, people who can't speak Canadian French are able to speak after a fashion, I think. A radical idea, but there it is.
Okay. That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed listening to Charles, you can subscribe to the Tumblr House YouTube channel. If you'd like to send Charles a question, you can contact us through the Tumblr House website. Thank you for watching.